Our third and last panel this afternoon. I have the pleasure of welcoming in this panel our generous host as one of the speakers. Heike Hanada will be presenting also her work, and I'm happy to also make a small introduction on you and your biography. Heike studied architecture at the HDK Berlin and at the Todai University of Tokyo. In 1994, she founded her studio Hanada Plus in Tokyo, and 2007 in Weimar. She works as an artist, as we've seen last night, and an architect in Berlin. In 2007, her work received international recognition through a competition that we all know of, the extension of the Asplund Library in Stockholm. She was teaching before at the University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam, and since 2018 she took over the Department for Building Typologies in Dortmund. Heike did not only receive the Prize of Rome, which is now sharing with us, but she was also a winner of the Thuringian Architectural Prize for her recently opened Bauhaus Museum in Weimar. Together in the same panel, the last panel tonight, Job Floris will be also speaking. Job is an architect and the co-founder of Monadnock. He obtained his master degree in architecture in Rotterdam at the Academy for Architecture and Urbanism, and followed up with his studies of visual design in St. Jost in Breda. Currently, the practice of Monadnock is building a substantial amount of housing project in the Netherlands and in Germany. Floris was a visiting professor in various universities throughout Europe, just to name some, Karlsruhe, Leuven or Graz. And right now, or I don't know, Floris, if it's still actual, 2020 you have been teaching at the fall studio at Harvard. Following, Verena von Beckerath, also a Berlin-based architect. She's a co-founder of the architectural practice Heide and von Beckerath. Very interestingly, you studied sociology, art theory and psychology in Paris and Hamburg, and then architecture in Berlin. After the studies, you were teaching as a research assistant at the UDK in Berlin too, and after the awards, a fellowship at the Academy of Schloss Solitude followed, and then the Rome Prize Villa Massimo 2013. You were a visiting professor at the TU Braunschweig, Cornell University, and at the moment, starting 2016, you took over the chair for design and housing at the Bauhaus University in Weimar. And our first speaker in the panel, Philippe Dujardin, who Heike was already talking about today, also involved in the predecessent symposium on the monumental with his work. He will be joining us with his artistic work as a photographer and visual artist. Philippe Dujardin is born in Ghent, where he still lives and works. That is where you also studies at the Ghent University and at the Royal Academy of Ghent. You studied photography. Since 2007, working as an independent architectural photograph and visual artist. And what we all have gotten to know and love during the past years are his photographies out of the series Fictions, which were shown for the first time at the Beaux-Arts in Brussels, a collection of digital photo collages and imagery of architecture. And parts of that collection were purchased by the MoMA and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Also, Filip was engaged in architectural exhibition projects like the Belgian Pavilion at the Architectural Biennale in Venezia 2018. Filip Dujardin, welcome. We are very happy to have you here as the opener.
Thank you for this nice introduction, and thank you, Heike, for inviting me in this beautiful setting of the villa. Today, in this presentation, I will show in a very fragmented. In a very fragmented way my work. So it's in bits and pieces. I hope the general idea is clear. In this presentation, I will make a kind of relation between my photo collages I made throughout the years and the spatial translation I did in the public space or in the semi-public space of an exhibition hall. So all these photo collages are evolved out of my practice as an architectural photographer. So architectural photography is a very specific way of looking at architecture. You look very closely and very focused on architecture. And throughout the years, I discovered what are the parts of architecture and the vocabulary. And amongst them is, of course, the typology. You focus on what are the elements that make a building. Also, I was interested what the social status, the economical status, and even the aesthetical status of a building in society is, and I try to document that through photography. But at a certain point, I felt a kind of frustration that I couldn't intervene more through the classic way of documenting a building through photography. And as I'm not an architect, I cannot actually build buildings. So I had to find a way to make new imagery where I had control over every aspect of an image, at least as the representation of architecture through an image. And that I came with this technique of the photo collage, the photorealistic photo collage that is that exists out of fragments of photographs of real buildings. So all the collages you see are constructed by images made by me. Not of my regular architectural photography, but I really are going out in the field. I make a design, for example, and then I'm going out in the field to photograph all the textures I need for constructing this fictitious building. Of course, in the beginning, I was very interested in the building as a sculpture in space, as a volume with its own silhouette, with all its techniques to make a building spectacular, like the cantilever. It's a trick in architecture that is often used to make a building expressive. So I give comment on that. I reconstruct it, I enlarge it, I make it more radical to that point that I think it's still plausible. So I walk on the thin line between reality and plausibility versus science fiction. So it's a fine line, and I try not to cross it. Also, humor is also is part of the work. It's a very difficult subject in architecture, I know. Maybe that's a content for a next symposium. But of course, I'm a Belgian. Belgian surrealism is apparently in our genes. So the surrealistic humorism is certainly present in my work. So the first image I will show is part of this series Memorial. This is Memorial number 2. And here you see a kind of compression of all the things that interested me in architecture. You see this layering in time. Normally, if you go through Rome, you see this kind of palazzo-type construction or division of a facade, but you only see the last phase of the final stage of that building. It still can change, probably not in Rome, but in other cities, you see the final stage of a building. Here I scraped off of course, in a fictitious way, the underlying ideas or propositions that were behind the final facade, and then you end up in an image like that, with all the historical references and even the contemporary references. And then I made this very small intervention in a gallery, but with the same idea. You have the original staircase, or it's up to you which one is the original one, and I built this new staircase that is an adaptation or another logic, bringing another logic into the existing space. On a slightly larger scale, I made an intervention in the concert hall of Bruges. It's a quite iconic building in Belgium, designed by Robrecht and Daam on the outskirts of Bruges. It's a very finished box, and for me it was very challenging to question when is a building finished. When it becomes an icon, then it's not, is it then becoming a dead building? And for me, it was very interesting to question the status of this building by adding tiny additions in red brick. And on the rooftop, I built this small, in actual bricks, to be clear. It was really built on top of the silhouette of this building. And on the inside, in this concrete spaces, I made this alternative structures, of course, completely nonsensical without a program, but only questioning the status of the actual space by adding new structures, suggesting an alternative logic to the building. Another collage is a comment on the so-called modernism in architecture, or the modernistic way of stacking uniformal boxes in one building, like this existing apartment building in Ghent. And there I put another logic, an organic logic to the building by adding new volumes in red brick. It's like a parasite attacking an existing building, and in that sense it's a kind of a comment on the rigid way of the modernistic tradition in stacking housing units. And that resulted, or that image was the basis to again build an actual installation in a museum in Hasselt in Z33, where I built this parasite walls inside the white museum spaces, and they give another view on the city, or a slight other view on the city. In the corner I put this strange remnants of a new building or an ancient building, and they adapt themselves to the tiny details of the plinth and the grill. And that resulted in the first memorial, Memorial 1, dealing with typology, of course, the typology of the column. It's so present here, of course. You see them here standing in the garden, just standing on their own. In fact, it's also a celebration of that typology in architecture, just by placing them as such without program, as a kind of folly architecture, just bearing a roof placed on a stage of 2 steps. And this resulted, this is a reference of an actual architectural photograph I made of a project in Belgium. Before renovation, this was the cellar of an old Congress building in Charleroi, and it was amazing to see that the upper floor was supported by this all kinds of weird columns in different shapes. So this really made a reference to the previous image. The column, again, I made this installation in the same museum, and I displaced this column, and I put that on a step of the staircase. So you have a completely other appreciation of this typology of a column. Just by climbing the staircase, you have this sequential vision of what a column actually is. And then I made this column, a bit of reference to Brancusi, of course. This stacking of this very basic breeze construction bricks into a 5-meter high column. That was very funny to see, but I don't have the video. It was moving in the wind, so it was a moving column. When the wind blew, you saw the bricks dancing in the air, so that was quite nice. Another typology, very common, is the buttress or the support of a building. And this typology I applied in an existing castle in Flanders. A castle in a very bad condition, almost crumbling down. It's a very iconic place, but they not well maintained. And there I built these two buttresses that I wasn't allowed to touch the building, ironically. So it needed really support, but I couldn't touch the building. So it worked out fine that the buttress stood on its own, and it had to keep itself in balance. And it was not leaning towards the architecture. And the other one was already detached from the building and was floating in the water. As an insert image, you could say, is that architecture, if I may say so. I'm not an architect, but I guess architects have to work with a certain vocabulary, with some elements that are fixed. You still have to work with the door, and you have to think about the door every time, and where to place a window, and how the roof will look like. So, in essence, an architect has a shelf in its office and has to take, metaphorically of course, has to take the right elements and put it in a certain order, and then you have architecture, probably. So this is a kind of vision of a giant shelf where you can pick all the pieces you want. A next image, a collage, I think it speaks for itself. It's a kind of time lapse of different styles of windows compressed into one building, expressing the identity of the inhabitant. A small installation in a museum in Ghent, where I collect marble plates from tabletops and cupboards in all different styles. So I have a whole collection of them, and I put them against the wall of this very historic building as a metaphor of a collection of different styles and textures and graphics of the marble, and they were placed in a certain composition in this context. And then in a second phase, I used the same plates to create this curved floor, where you have this collection of all kinds of shapes and with all its historical references, and then you have the space between the plates, the joints that have this very particular graphic. Another project, also dealing with the basic typologies in architecture, but placed in a certain sequence. This is a project near the river, the Leie in Kortrijk in Belgium, where I built in essence a wall of around 40 meters in length. But the wall is kept straight by all the basic typologies in architecture, like the roof and the chimney and the arch and others. And it's a kind of compression of the language architects use in one gesture. You could see it also as a kind of open folded house, or even a reference to the typical Flemish phenomenon of the ribbon housing that you see all the way along the highways. All the villages are connected, so you can't see the landscape anymore. They call it ribbon houses. You see all these houses that connects the villages. I think in Germany and especially in the Netherlands, the villages are more visibly separated. So this is also a little comment on it in a very abstract way. So some images. Of course, the roof has the fifth facade of a building, a bit underestimated often. For me, it was interesting to make an image like this, and then that resulted in another images on a bigger scale of a Dutch city, Middelburg, and where I compressed. I made several views of the city and compressed them in one image, so it's not so dense in reality. And then I erased all windows in order to strengthen the focus on the different types of roofs. And here and there I did some little accidents, of course, like here. This is added. And this resulted also in a spatial installation in the midst of the historical city center, where I used the roof as the fifth facade and as a typology in a kind of spatial grid, where I used these metal roofings in a certain sequence, also a metaphor of a compression of the city into one gesture, or into one gesture with the size of an average house in the city. Of course, architecture, as you know, of course, that it's all in proportion and proximity and the silhouette. And for me, it was quite interesting to explore how an ensemble of maybe not so interesting separate parts, but if you put them together in a certain sequence with a certain proportion, it's getting exciting. The same is going on here. It's also exploring tectonics of building. It could be a high-tech building, but it's executed in a very low-tech way. So this contrast between the planned and the improvised is also quite present in my work. Even on a bigger scale, this is the an inventory of some Chicago towers, but placed in a different grid, and they form this silhouette of a big house. The same is going on here, this time lapse of 2 or 3 periods in the history of the high rise in Chicago. You see this, maybe you recognize the original shape of the Willis Tower, executed with the previous phase of the first generation skyscrapers. Also, thinking about nature, culture versus culture, or nature versus architecture, and all the zones in between, the transition between the city and the nature, and where it collides. So this is a collage dealing about that. Another collage, you can question which thing was first. Was the rock placed there afterwards, or the other way? That resulted in a project where I used this rock, and I worked on it because the previous rock was really an existing rock in Morocco I photographed, placed on the Belgian coast. This is the same silhouette of the same rock, but I executed it in concrete. So I photographed these fake grottos in concrete. You find them everywhere. This fake rock in concrete, and I put it on the original silhouette of the rock, and then it was printed on a giant scale, on a kind of billboard, and was placed in the midst of the landscape of Bruegel. You were talking about, no, who was talking about Bruegel? Val. Yes, this was for a project for the anniversary of Bruegel, who worked and lived around Brussels in this typical landscape. So he painted that landscape with rocks. So he was a kind of Photoshop artist avant la lettre. So what I did, I used the same technique as Bruegel, and I put a rock in midst of this landscape where it doesn't belong, of course. It's a Fremdkörper. And I make it in 2 ways even more artificial. It's in concrete, and it's flat. So this is even an emphasis on the artificiality of the landscape in general, and in specific the Bruegel landscapes. Fremdkörper, you could say. It's even on a larger scale. This is Brussels, where I put two situations into one image. That's the nice part of making collages. You can do whatever you want in a completely irresponsible way. And that's what I do on these cityscapes. This is Katowice in Poland, where I photographed the skyline in a 360 way. And all the high-rise, old and new buildings I compressed into one image in a maybe too orderly way. So you have this strange cityscape where the large objects are a bit too symmetrical. This is my hometown of Ghent. It's a very flat town. I created this kind of Tower of Babel with existing material, but just in a slight change of topography. Speaking of cities, another project I did in a gallery was building a wall with the most common building materials I bought in the do-it-yourself market, these Breeze bricks and these Eton bricks. And I built this very well-defined wall as a metaphor of the complexity and the diversity of a city compressed in one wall. In the end, the wall was erected and looked like that. It reminded me of the Piccionis architecture on the Philopapos hill and the Acropolis hill in Greece, where the architect used remnants he found on site, old remnants, and he built this beautiful pathways, and he built a new wall around an existing church. And this is a fragment of this this church wall. Another one in Greece. This on the island of Paros, I found this incredible building existing out of fragments of ancient Greek buildings, and were later on stacked in a different way in this amazing tower-like building. And in the end, I think a lot of the fate or the destiny of a lot of architecture is to be crumbled again to dust. Not in Rome, but in some other places. I made this virtual pile of building debris where you can see, if you look very closely, all kinds of references of contemporary concrete, but you also see these ancient columns and statues. So this is a kind of compression of the architectural history in a very deconstructed way. This ended up in a new installation. A friend of mine bought this little farmhouse, and before demolition, I had the idea to stack the debris in a certain geometric form. So it's the same building, but in a completely other form. It was really nice to do it. I did it with my own hands. This resulted in a small object I did, amongst others, but that's the only one I showed, this little bowl made of also fragments of building debris. On a bit larger, fragmented scale, I built this installation in an inside space. It's in essence, it was a room. You can see the room has, this is the original ground floor plan of the room based on one of the square grid of the ceiling. But as you can see, the room fell apart in different parts, so you couldn't perceive the room as such. So it became a kind of mental room. If you walk through the remnants, you could reconstruct the original room or think about another room. And then out of the rubble, new architecture emerges. The most basic architecture, as I heard already, it's creating a void. If you build a wall, you have a boundary. You create an inside and outside space. I did it in a very private room. I built this tiny wall around the chair. The work is called The Guest, but you can't sit. You can't sit on the chair. It's just a very basic way of showing what architecture in essence is. It's creating inside, outside, private, public, and the execution of the joints on the inside was very rough, and on the outside it was much smoother. And then to celebrate my fascination for the brick, or the breeze brick in general, and the potentiality this pixel of architecture has, I made a replica of this red breeze brick into the Italian Carrara marble. Thank you.
Thank you, Filip, for this inspiring lecture. Thank you, Adria, for the introduction. And thank you, Hannah, for the invitation. And thank you, Julia, for the generosity that we can be here. And I'm totally overwhelmed how this place encourages us to gather between generations. And we all come from different places and different professional and artistic backgrounds. And I'm really enjoying to be back here again. The title of my lecture is Not Quite But Close, and I will unveil later where this comes from and where it refers to. My thoughts begin with an observation during a 3-month stay at Villa Massimo 9 years ago. Spending my first weeks going on long walks through Rome, I was eventually drawn to the periphery of the city. The extensive Parco degli Acquedotti, which links into the park at Via Appia, was equally fascinating as the 1950s residential areas from the Ina Casa program by Saverio Muratori, Mario De Renzi, and Alberto Libera. So the image you see is a building by Libera at Tuscolano. On a rainy day in early May, I came upon 4 women from Romania who were celebrating Orthodox Easter in the shelter of an overgrown arch fragment of an aqueduct. They generously offered me a share of their cake. The scene brought up images from Pier Paolo Pasolini's film Mamma Roma. We have already seen images, but I'm not showing an image. I just want you to imagine the scene. Where the then still unkempt landscape with its monumental ruins bordering onto the Quartiere Tuscolano dominates the day-to-day life of Ettore, the protagonist's young son, and absorbs him and his peers in a parallel reality. We've seen Ettore before. The second observation is on the face of it only indirectly my own. It is founded in a piece by the artist Fiona Tan, whose work I saw at the Italian Pavilion of the Architecture Biennale in 2010 in Venice. The film Cloud Island, from where the still comes, from the year 2010, portrays in a few extremely serene takes the life of the people and their spaces on the small Japanese island Inojima in the Seto Inland Sea. The island's industrial past is characterized by a quarry and a copper mine. The only village still inhabited by a few old people is overlain by simple and low-key built interventions that illustrate the process of its social and spatial transformation over a long period of time. When we visited Inojima in September 2017 during an excursion with students from Bauhaus Universität Weimar, a botanical garden had only recently been completed, with a greenhouse in its center, vacant for a long time, and now rejuvenated. Responsible for these interventions is the Tokyo-based architect Kazuyo Sejima, who had been commissioned by the Benessi Foundation in the context of the Setouchi Triennale and the Inojima Art House project. The botanical garden had been created by her in collaboration with Akarui Heya, including the flower designer Yutaka Kizaki and community garden planner Atsuo Hashizume. Not only is it a particularly beautiful garden, I will show you the garden. Not only is it a particularly beautiful garden, but a productive one that connects the island inhabitants' knowledge about the cultivation and use of native plants with activities for both locals and visitors. On the day of our visit and during an unexpected workshop with a chef who had come from Tokyo, the life garden on Inojima became a collective space. Now there's a quote. A garden opens up space for making and experiencing. It ritualizes our existence and gives it meaning. Attention and care weave living nature together with our human condition. The garden is a mirror of the maker and the user, in whom it is reflected simultaneously. The garden is a social space for family, friends, and companions, in adversity and, therefore, as an emancipatory and liberating power. As an effective space, the garden transcends its own boundaries. As an experimental space, it represents a place in which the world can be known and understood. So the quote was from Eric A. de Jong in a text called, titled Forward Like a Mirror in a book titled On the Necessity of Gardening. It was recently published, so you might have seen it already. The environmental crisis and deepening political and economic division in society lend the concept of the public, as well as the Anthropocene, or rather the Stulocene, as Donna Haraway puts it, or suggests, a central position in artistic and architectural discourse. This gives the transformation and adaptation of existing built structures and spaces particular significance. The observations on the southeastern periphery of Rome and those on Inojima justify discussion about shared spaces beyond the city and its buildings, streets, and squares, not without casting a glance back to them. In these transitional spaces, architecture and nature coexist, absorbing forms of everyday and public life alike. Are these spaces with their specific characteristics and forms of appropriation an expression of an increasing dissolution of the public realm? This is for Heike, sorry. Or do they imply a differentiated, ambiguous, and equally collective understanding of publicness against the background of a fragmented social and political environment? So I'm now presenting 3 projects, briefly, only aspects of them, but I would like to transfer the idea which I suggested when presenting the idea of the garden to our projects. We are not gardeners yet, even though a friend of mine, a colleague, Wilfried Kühn, suggested to me a few weeks ago, we will all become gardeners, but we are not yet. The Michel Mayeros estate contains the estate and archive of the Luxembourg artist Michel Mayeros, who died in an accident in 2002. The artist's former studio is located on the ground floor in the inner courtyard of a Wilhelminian tenement in Berlin-Prenzlauer Berg. In order to accommodate exhibitions at the studio and use it for processing the estate, a multi-part space-forming piece of furniture that would contain the archive together with a suitable lighting concept were designed. The design concept for the space is based on the intention of largely retaining the studio rooms and kitchen as they were furnished by the artist. The new piece is made up of several elements painted the same shade of white as the walls. When pushed together and closed, it forms a solid unit. When open, its differentiated and colored interior is revealed, whose outer contour corresponds to the existing opening between kitchen and studio. So you can see the kitchen in the back. In order to use it from both rooms and also allow the closed unit to be moved to either side of the opening, it was equipped with trolleys and rails and laid in the street. The piece of furniture makes it possible to set up the workshop in the heated kitchen in winter and close the opening. A dimmable light panel on the joist in the kitchen reinforces the room concept by accommodating and developing the lighting system, which consists of rows of narrow fluorescent tubes as found in the studio spaces. So the tubes in the studio space were still decided for by Michel before he died, and we took the same tubes and made this dimmable set of tubes to allow for the kitchen to be an exhibition space when lit and to be a kitchen, or the kitchen, how it was before. The Konrad Fischer Gallery was founded in 1967, and most of you might know the gallery. It's a very famous gallery in Düsseldorf by Konrad and Dorothee Fischer, when they opened a tiny exhibition space in a disused alley in the center of Düsseldorf, with an exhibition of Karl André's work, Minimal and Conceptual Art, were virtually unknown in Europe, and their approach consisted of inviting the artists to Düsseldorf rather than just presenting their works. This not only led to the development of an international network of artists, it also contributed to the creation of site-specific sculptures, paintings, and installations. And I would like to show you 3 artworks. This one is by Lawrence Weiner, who recently passed away, and my title is dedicated to him, as you can see. And the next one is a piece by Karl André, and the third one by Manfred Pernis. And the interesting thing about these 3 artworks is that they were implemented in the building before we started to transform it. So the plans were already there, but it was a very precious moment where the building was presenting the artworks without being transformed by architecture. Some people said we shouldn't touch anything, it should stay like this forever. But we couldn't, because the gallery needed neutral spaces and white walls. And what we did then was the following. The building in Berlin-Mitte was designed by the architect Hans-Heinrich Müller in 1928 to accommodate distribution facilities. The listed building was later used as a substation, which had been disused since 1998. Its facade of red blend brick and the vertical bands of narrow windows behind which a sculptural staircase leads to the utility stories are clearly visible from Neue Grünstraße, as the original front building no longer exists. The transformation envisaged, I don't know how to pronounce it, a change of use in the former substation and its grounds into an art gallery. To achieve this, the building was gutted and its steel skeleton exposed in the process. So we didn't touch the staircase, and with the people who were responsible for the Denkmalschutz, we discussed that we would protect the facade and also the space behind. So it's a kind of 3-dimensional facade that was protected, but the room behind was transformed. And we also worked with Anne Borsell, who's listening. She cannot be here, but she consulted us as a lighting designer, which is very nice. Okay, here you can see the floor plan with the neutral space. The basic layout contains 3 double stories with slightly raised ground floor and 2 exhibition spaces above, each consisting of a full floor and a gallery floor. This is what you can see here. This is the second double height exhibition space. The architectural concept is twofold. It is based on the preservation of the facade and the staircase with industrial glazing, which is typical for the period, and on creating mainly neutral spaces at the rear. Along with the renovations, here you can see an artwork by Karl André, which was exhibited in 1967 when the gallery in Düsseldorf was opened. Along with the renovations in line with heritage protection requirements, the necessary structural improvements, and the installation of building services, special attention was paid to the gallery spaces, their surfaces, lighting fixtures and fittings, as well as the fenced in-grounds. So there's a garden in front because the building is missing that was there before, and here you can see an artwork by Thomas Schütte. We also met Thomas Schütte before. So it's a kind of rotation, I have the feeling. And the garden we made, the fenced garden we made, and also the view on the public space of the street with new developments from the 1990s, because this site is almost where the Berlin Wall had been, so it was a vast part of the city. So the last project is a housing project. It is in Fürth, in the south of Germany. You can see, again, a Wilhelminian building. It's very different than Berlin. It's, the city became rich in the second half of the 19th century during industrialization, and it was based on more than 20 mirror factories in the city of Fürth. This is not a mirror factory, but it stands for the industrial past of Fürth. And the project is the transformation of a former mirror factory. We couldn't keep the buildings because of all the poison in the quicksilver poison in the ground. We kept one brick building, a kind of a forge that is now a workshop. And what is interesting about the site is that it goes through a block, so there's block buildings on one side, and then it goes down 4 meters. And on the other side, in the north, there is the river Pignitz and the lands that come with it's the city park now, but it's a very it's rather a landscape and suburban part of the city. And we also found in the inner city, in the medieval city of Fürth, these passages, and we proposed a very dense building on the site, not without proposing a public pathway through the site from one street to the other. This is the forge on the right side, so this is in the middle of the site. This is a detail of the galleries that access the apartments. And this is the most important plan from my point of view. It shows the ground level, and you can see that the ground level has 2 heights. And we worked in detail on how the ground level could be enriched by different spatial characteristics, such like gardens, the pathway, a staircase, as you can see, that also serves as an auditorium. And there's also a communal space. It's called the Spiegelsaal, and it can open widely, and then it is also connected to the public pathway. And this is the staircase still covered with, still covered because it was still the construction site. And now I'm to my last slide. I'm reading again. I returned to Rome, still impressed by an exhibition at the Palazzo Chini in Venice, which I have visited in September 2021. the Piranesi Roma Basilico exhibition, which had been previously shown in similar formats at the Ungers Archive in Cologne, as well as in other places, and juxtaposes Piranesi's Roman Vedute with photographs by Gabriele Basilico. In between these two images, the space is lying that I'm trying to unfold. Thank you.
So, thank you, Heike. Thank you, Adria, for inviting me on this very special day. I'm very happy to be here and to take part in this event. Thank you, Verena. So here we go. In a world that seems to develop more and more towards transparency, quantification, and photorealism, the act of consciously being suggestive and incomplete rather becomes a challenge, while architecture, among other disciplines related to the arts, is a cultural act. I believe this requires a suggestive narrative in order to survive. And a fragment, by definition, incorporates a suggestion of a bigger whole and should appeal to a certain level of imagination from the observer. We wouldn't like to end up explaining what tongue-in-cheek exactly means, do we? So I will share some considerations on the fragmental and the suggestive. For this, I will use two of our projects for visual pleasure and for charging my arguments. For today, I would like to distinguish two types of fragments. The first one are the particles, or small singular objects connecting to a broader whole. There's a small building we realized a couple of years ago. Its name is The Landmark, and for this occasion I will explain it as a folly, as its main function is to be there as a beacon, as a gesture, or as a symbol. Because the landmark has brought structure to the rather undefined fabric of this small new town called New Bergen, and brought the sorely missed character to this place, aiming for a quality that Aldo Rossi managed to achieve in several of his projects, to enhance a sense of place by just one singular building, to change the reading of a place by a singular building. And of course, this particular building was for some way too artificial. For others, it was way too nostalgic. And for others, it was too complex to comprehend. Also, we have experienced aversion by fellow architects for the level of figuration instead of abstraction. Abstraction which so much seems to dominate the expression of architecture since modernism stepped into the arena. So nowadays, we find architecture that aims to detach, behaving almost like a standalone, turning away from any clue of what has been there before in architecture. While I think figuration helps us so much better to build up narratives, and the fragment is a helpful tool, being a container of knowledge, referencing to other worlds, giving a hint, suggesting and referencing is a transfer of knowledge, one we need to survive as a discipline. And although we believe the landmark building is charged with civic intentions, like almost a compact motor block, gallantly performing the role of a civic beacon, there was a certain discovery that slightly changed our reading of our own project. So it was here in the old cemetery of Bergen where we found an old tower structure. To explain a bit or elaborate a bit, Bergen forms the authentic town on the other side of the provincial road, and that was there first, and later in the 60s, on the other side of the provincial road, the town of New Bergen was realized, and that's where the landmark is situated. Forms a sort of modern mirror. This ruin of a Roman tower originates from the 13th century. It used to be a complete church, which was destroyed and rebuilt several times throughout history. Now only the tower remained, not only offering a beautiful irregular silhouette, but also has a rich bouquet of various stones and bricks and pieces of mineral, compiled throughout time and locally crafted, revealing a type of growth over time like the annual rings of a tree. This, of course, offers a welcome moment of reflection. For us, it was a missed opportunity to make a relation with this building because we did not know that this building existed. Because it also addressed the eternal, you could say. One type of beauty is involving the suggestive by means of decay. Ever since meeting this opposite pole, we wish for our tower building to also become a beautiful ruin. The second way of thinking about a fragment are, I would say, lines. When solitary fragments are charged with suggestion of something larger, they could also be able to enclose a certain monumentality, a promise of a bigger entity which never succeeded to get finished for various reasons. When this promise turns out to be strong enough, it's able to resonate and inspire for a long time. This brings in mind a specific work of Palladio, when Palladio was commissioned to design and build the Palazzo Porto Breganze in 1571 in the city of Vicenza. He must have been ambitious in the making of a large building with a public character. Fortunately, he did not succeed in this specific case and left us with the beauty of a suggestion. It's a beautiful example of the power of the unfinished and the suggestive. As the result was completely not intended as such, it raises the question whether architects are even able to fully embrace this idea of implementing a suggestion by means of incompleteness. The size of the fragment could indeed suggest this as a conventional house, yet the facade is charged with the ambition to communicate with the public. The colossal order amplifies the importance of the building and uses the strategy of overscaling, providing for a remarkable character. And I think it was shown already by somebody else yesterday. In many occasions, I have expressed my love for a particular building of Borromini. Being in Rome today, we can't leave it out, of course, and the Baroque church of San Carlo alla Quattro Fontane seems adequate to explain the idea of joining several fragments into a new delicate balance. I think this elaborate building forms a corner piece, which seems to be able to perform on many levels at the same time. As it obeys to the rules of the street, it's confirming its perimeter, and it also provides for a classical corner accent and makes two completely different faces merged into one. This is a building that we are currently working on. These two references, Palladio and Borromini, we had in our minds while working on the small domestic building in the medieval city of Grave, which is in the east of the Netherlands, close to the German border, something we have on our tables currently. The building is situated on a triangular plot, and it's visible from all sides. It's close to an old fortification wall. The building marks the entrance of the historic city, and therefore wants to relate to the existing historical buildings there, which might best define the building as a sort of oxymoron, as it has to unify two demands in one, blending in as well as standing out and announcing, with an ambiguous building as a result, merging several buildings into one. And the remaining fortifications in the city of Grave also comprised a former gate, which was later transformed into a local museum, where we were making a relation to this old brick structure, although it would be impossible to ever experience both at the same time. And among several questions for us, the most prominent was how to act in public, although initially fit for a domestic function. Simultaneously, the aim is to charge this building with a theme that goes beyond the private and refers to the public. This building should not literally become a gate. It would not fit on the plot. Therefore, we would follow the strategy of making a building that suggests to be part of a bigger whole, to make a relation with the official gate, containing elements indicating the former fortification and making visitors aware of entering the ancient city. In this specific situation, a balancing act between being figurative and being abstract was required for building up a narrative without using all the possible vocabulary, how to suggest being a fragment of a larger whole. The internal structure of this building is made secondary in order to shape the building by its urban setting and its role as a gate building. The inscribing of the new building into a longer line in the history of the city is made primary. Not everyone will understand this implicit invitation to explore. Suggestion is an attempt to evoke curiosity, and of course, this also requires a refined observer. As you can see, it's still a model. It might get realized, I hope so. Otherwise, it just remains a suggestion and exists in the world of ideas. And although we as architects were trained in clearness, completeness, and efficiency, additionally, it is necessary to allude to other questions and build up narratives on other logics. When no full cohesion exists any longer, one is forced to recalibrate and explore other forms of order and other orders of form. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Job, and all the others. And thank you, audience, for the patience. So I will try to be as short as possible. I have to say, when I prepared the small presentation, I decided to divide it in 3 parts. And it was too long, so then I cut off the first part, and I show you of the first part only one image. The division is called, the first part is about islands, the second one about the wall, and the third part is about fragments. So the left part of the islands is just this image of this video I showed just now at the exhibition. Because I think it's, yeah, it's for me a strong desire to reflect our relationship to nature, and this invasion of starlings, which is coming back every year in autumn to Rome, and it seems to grow from year to year, made me think of how we can find a different way how to let nature how to let nature be part of our daily life. And as you can see here, the starlings are, this is a still from this video, and I made this video here in the Villa Massimo one evening when they just came back from being outside during the daytime. They are in the surrounding areas of Rome, and at night they come back to settle down and to find a place to sleep. And their movement, and this maybe you can see in the video, is rather like they are escaping from tree to tree because they are not yet sure where they could find a place to rest. And this is kind of forming to me like an island, so they look for something where they find a place. So the second part I want to start with now is about walls. And since I'm studying architecture, walls have a certain impact on me, and maybe also because of what Oda today mentioned, because of the huge fire-resisting walls in Berlin. And in fact, when Oda and me have been in the same course, at that time I made a collection of photographs also, I'm sure you still remember, and tried to make a project out of it, which wasn't easy at all. Anyway, recently I found this quote by Hannah Arendt about the public space, and I was very deeply touched because I never thought about of a wall in this way. She's writing, "The Greek law was really a wall of law, and has as such created the space of a polis. Without that wall, there could be a city in the sense of a collection of houses for people to live together, an asti, but no polis. No city-state as a political community. The wall of the law was sacred, but not itself. Only what is enclosed was actually political." And I think we live today in a moment where walls are not very popular in our understanding, or let's say we have difficulties to speak about walls because walls are very often misused for political power. But this interpretation of Hannah Arendt maybe gives us a hint how much our culture is relating on the existing of a wall. And therefore, I also think that this project, for example, by Ungers, would not have been existed without this political situation at that moment. And this is striking to me because, of course, it is a negative wall at that time. And on the other hand, it had an influence and maybe artistic reflection on the thinking of a city of the years after the World War II, to build up this idea of a green archipelago within the wall of Berlin. On the other hand, when you are in Rome and you see all these fragments of the wall, of the walls of the aqueducts and the wall of the Aurelian wall or the other city walls, they still exist. I think this fragmentation of the wall gives us a hint how much the wall as a fragment will influence our perception of space. And as I think this is maybe the point where I would think that I could start with, that my perception is shifting when I have a fragmented wall in front of me. And as you can see here, the Villa Borghese, actually built outside of the Aurelian wall, also still enclosed each little garden park with a fence or with a wall, which I recently found this etching, and I was very impressed how defined each little quarter of this garden must have been, and of course you can still find it today. And interesting interestingly maybe also is that, this is the photograph which shows the garden of the Villa Borghese, and it looks also today like that. But Schinkel also kind of surrounded in his sketch for the Tiergarten, he also started to surround each part of this forest-like garden or park with a as a border or boundary, built boundary. And when I was living in Japan, of course, you have only the images to study, because at that time, it was in the 90s, I couldn't go to the library just to read, because I was not able to read Japanese. I could speak Japanese, but I couldn't read it. So I had more or less only the paintings and the observations in the city and the temples, and etc. And I ordered a lot of books from Germany to have something to deal with. And by the time I discovered certain relationships between images, which had basically nothing to do with each other, but still they show me this very similar intention of how to interpret space. And this is, for example, one of these pairs I found. So on the left-hand side, you see Caspar David Friedrich, the Gartenterrasse, painted 1811. And on the other side, you see the temple in Tsuji in Kyoto. And in each picture, you see that the wall, the garden wall, is separating the garden, the private part, from another part of nature, an idealized nature, in the far distance. And on the other hand, the foreground is settled in a way, in an arrangement, a defined arrangement, which is trying to deal with the scenery behind in a dialogue. So in Japanese, this is called shake, the broad landscape. And this kind of dialogue you can only, I think, develop when you perceive something in a fragmented way. That's what I believe. Otherwise, it would be just enclosed. But by this lowering down this, for example, in the case of Tsuji, this hedge, so that you have actually this middle ground supported by the trees, and then the view through these trees stems towards the distance. I think then you start to change your perception. And a similar image I found recently in a museum here in the park of Villa Borghese. And this painting by Giacomo Balla maybe also shows us this kind of distant view, or the distance makes us perceive the space in a very abstract and modern way, as it already does with the painting of Caspar David Friedrich. And if you then compare it with the collage of Mies van der Rohe for the sunken garden of the National Gallery in Berlin, also you feel that there is this relationship between the interior and these layers of space he always used to define the space, and the space behind this actually now higher garden wall to really enclose this inner space of the sunken garden. And I was also very impressed how dense he imagined the space beyond this garden wall would be, because it's suddenly a jungle. It is a Tiergarten, maybe, just overrolling the place, and you can see it in his site plan from the time 1963, that he was actually thinking to just surround the National Gallery by a kind of forest, which is an interpretation of mine, but I would say it is clearly drawn. And then I very often went with my students when I was still teaching at the Fachhochschule in Potsdam, to the National Gallery to make them, to start to photograph. At that time I was a teacher for Gestaltung, so it was one of the exercises we did together. And this is a photograph of my students. And it was in an autumn where this garden was so beautiful. And it was just the year before the National Gallery had to close because of renovation and reconstruction. And to my sad experience, this whole garden disappeared because of several reasons. But what I think what happened here in the sunken garden is something what really misintended. Let's say that the position of these bushes and the position of the Sockel for the sculptures melted together into one landscape. And I think it is something very, very beautiful what happened here, because the hedges and things were cut in a way that it became a one topography itself. And I wonder how it will develop in the future, because this all had to disappear, mainly because the stepping stones were not safe enough anymore for, I guess, for the insurance companies, for the people, because they wanted to make the space accessible again, and then therefore they had to take it off. That's so far as I know. But however, when I come back to my exhibition here in Rome, I started with this idea, because I thought maybe we need some spaces in the city which are not untouchable for human. And this is meant by this collage with the ellipses, black holes in the city which are not penetrable, betretbar, not, we can't go in. And so this is more an idealistic point of view. But on the other hand, I think it would be maybe a method that we reconsider ourselves and our relationship towards the other species. And of course, these ellipses, Dartmouth Venus is actually an idea which comes from Herman de Vries, an artist who already built it in Münster. I'm sure, Peter, you know it. And it's a project he did in several places, but as far as I know, each time rather in a garden scenery. And the difference here would be that I imagine these places in the, let's say, in the midst of the traffic. So in places where there is not the green yet. And yes, so that means these ellipses are surrounded by a wall. And sometimes you could have a view to look inside, but you can never go inside yourself. This is upside down, I'm afraid. I found it out too late, we couldn't change it. But I'm sorry for that. And then the other idea, I thought what is very important to develop if you think of a city in the future is the public transportation system. And as Berlin already is lack of a good transportation system, in Rome it's even worse, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to say that, but I think that there's really a high need to develop it if we want to see in the future a different life on the world. So I believe that the individual car traffic is not a good or positive development for the future. So I hope that we are becoming more rational and more willing to change our lifestyle. And this is, again, there are 4 ellipses. It's also an idealistic drawing, but it could be a way to offer this to Rome. And in the second step, we decided then to stick on the Aurelian wall. So that means this blue line here. This is all where the Aurelian wall is, and I think next to it one could very well, and here's the river, rebuild a public transportation system in a way, in a very monumental way, like the Romans were able to do. And I wonder if we can't do this, maybe. Yes. The third note on fragments has a lot to do with my thinking about monumentality, and this quote by Wittgenstein is also maybe a hint. A work of art, therefore, if it is not and does not want to be a monument in some way, is not a work of art. That is to say, a spirit that animates other human creatures should dwell in it, which lives on what it as long as the matter, the form carries in itself lasts. Well, of course, a provocative statement. On the other hand, if you see the drawing by Gilli, the scenery, the landscape scenery with fragments, geometrical fragments, cubes, I see that it has this very, very strong relationship to this idea of a modern object in collection. And these stairs, Appia developed, and I was very glad that you also showed Appia today. It's for me personally a hint how we can use a monumental gesture by fragmenting it, and still you have this kind of power to define a place, to give a place an identity. And on the other hand, when you have the photographs of Le Corbusier, he seems to have the similar interest in this movement of the ruins of the ground, and where the stepping stones are still left, but becoming a landscape in itself. So in a very archaic sense, I believe that this monumentality could help us to bring forward our definition of space in the future. And yeah, this image I love also very much by Mies van der Rohe, just sitting in Epidaurus at the end of his life, thinking whatever he thinks, but when you see his stairs for the terrace, for the Farnsworth house, it seems also this is a fragmented classical movement of stairs. And on the other hand, of course, I always have in the memory, in the mind, some Japanese definitions of space, and one of the most impressive stairs I know are these stepping stones of Villa Katsura in Kyoto, because they're not at all comfortable, but somehow really defining each stone as an object, each stone was fragmented in this grassland for this main entrance. And this was very important when I developed the bench for the Bauhaus Museum, because the Bauhaus Museum is a very enclosed, massive building. It has almost no windows. It's a solid enclosure, and everything inside seems to be more or less secret or hidden. But I wanted to break this movement of the facade, and therefore I decided for the long passage in front of the facade to have these benches. And as I forgot to say before, I think the question of a stair and a bench is also coming together at a certain point. This is maybe starting with Appia's image before. So here you can see it also at the entrance in detail. And of course it has something to do with the, for me, extremely important work of Rachel Whiteread. Therefore I'm so happy and honored that she will come tonight to talk to us. And here you see one of her sculpture works she did. She showed that in Berlin at the Guggenheim Museum some years ago, and I think by turning it down and this play between positive and negative space, gives us another sensibility and another vision of what an element can be, an architectonic element. And this leads to a competition I did together with Ayşe Erkmen. Ayşe Erkmen was asking me to join And we were participating, I think 7 teams were participating in this competition for the Kunstmuseum in Winter tour. We were asked to redefine the entrance, basically the entrance hall, but we decided to start already in the outside and to create a new staircase, and not only on this side, but also on the park side, as you can see here. And we wanted to have a kind of a topographical landscape, so the stairs and steps would be both stepping stones and seats at the same time, to break, in a way, the monumentality of the building, but on the other hand also to shift it to another usage for the people of the town. And here you can see the black part is the building, and on the south you have the side of the city, and on the back side, north, the side of the park. And of course we had also to deal with the problem of a ramp, but I think it worked quite well now how to combine it. And here you see how the space is flowing through from south to north through the foyer, and here these elements are also in the same concrete, meant that there's this memory of the stepping stones outside, bringing it inside the space, and this is then the interior perspective. So we are hoping to realize this project in 2024, I think. We have to wait because there is a big Caspar David Friedrich exhibition in between, so we are now finished the design phase, and now we have a stop, and then we will continue again. And as a last project, it's a competition I never won, but somehow I thought it's rounding up the lecture. It's a competition for the Einheits- und Freiheitsdenkmal in Berlin, for the Monument for Unity and Freedom, it's called. So they asked in front of the Humboldt Forum, which you see here, the castle. So this, I'm talking about, oh, it's so difficult for me, this part. To redefine a Sockel which is left over, which was left over. So I'm talking about the Sockel of this huge monument of Kaiser Wilhelm, which was destroyed during the war. And as you can see here, the water is flowing through this Sockel. And when I read the program for the competition, I thought it's impossible to think what is a monument for freedom or monument for unity, because, yeah, how shall we define it? And the only thing what I then remembered when I was still living in Berlin before opening the wall was maybe this feeling when you could reach a roof and then you were suddenly underneath of the sky, and you had this kind of feeling of to be free and to be alone. So I thought it's an experience which is maybe solid, so you feel more on an island, not too much in a public open space where everybody can see you. So what we decided to do is to design a very organic landscape above the Sockel with several staircases going in, but it would have been surrounded by a wall. And yes, you can see maybe here in the upper section, you see this tunnel where the water goes through, and then basically we just tried to double the volume, and you can see that this volume would have also hollows where you could enter. And from the outside, you would not see anything. So, thank you very much. So, we can make a break, I guess. Break? No? Yeah. Can we? Or do we don't have time? No? Oh, okay. So we have to continue with the discussion again. Okay. Sorry, I was too long also. Yeah. Then we continue.
So we're almost there. Heike, this was a beautiful closing of a circle with a void that you cannot enter. Before your presentation, I was making notes and thinking we should speak together at the end of this panel about incidents, intentions, suggestions, and I was searching for the fourth word. But of course it was there from the very beginning, from your invitation, and it is monumentality. Because monumentality is something that is able to enclose in a very certain way issues of meaning, of an idea, and somehow in your methods, what you presented, through the construction of incidents or impossible realities, or the idea of suggesting realities that are either not there or will never be there in terms of being finished or not finished. And Verena, you put in the center of your presentation the idea of transition, which is also included in forms of suggestiveness, transition from one state to the other, metamorphosis. And for that you also had a metaphor, that of the garden. That's why, and it's we also got lucky to have a little accident. Filip's lecture received an unplanned title. It was called Playing in the Ruins, but actually his intention, it was Verena's title. I know, something happened in between. So, nevertheless, it is an invitation actually to make a precise definition maybe on the difference between intended fragments and non-intended fragments. And I think this is one topic that we haven't reached yet. And starting with this accident, but also more than that through the content of your 4 lectures, I would invite and would like to start with you, Filip, to think together a little bit on the idea of intentionality, because a lot of your works, the ones that you called compressed, you were using the term quite often to show us this means of trying to reach the essence of things. That is what happens through compression. You leave things out, or you reduce them to something that could be their essence. And you do that in your collages, and even more impressive than when the collages become space and you build them, they become even more suggestive, but they do that because you leave things out. That was the difference that I realized in your lecture today. When you are collaging as a photo artist, you are working quite different as when you are building these sculptures, because you are putting a lot of things in the collages, and when you are building objects, you are reducing. And that's why I would like to start with that and ask you about the intention behind things, and how much you imagine already when you start your work, and how much happens in between while doing it, while working on it.
What was the last question?
These long questions always.
the last part.
It was about your intention. How clear is the image of what you are realizing when you start, and how much happens incidentally in between when you start a collage and.
Well, in general, I want to have a clear view on things.
Yeah.
Yeah, as an architectural photographer in the first place, I want to analyze a building through the frame of a camera. And then I even want to explore more my understanding by creating my own kind of architecture, by creating these digital photomontages and putting things together in my order, not in the order by somebody else, but in my composition, in my construction. And that's I'm not an architect. Maybe I'm a failed architect. I didn't study architecture. Maybe I should. Or no, I didn't. No, I envy. I think it's a very hard job. It's in some cases I'm very happy I'm not an architect, and sometimes the architects envy me for that. That I have this freedom to create whatever I want, without constraints and so on. So no, it's a longing to build in some way, to understand architecture, and in the end, I had also the longing to construct in real space, and that's the process. You could say that in the first place I document reality, and then it becomes fiction by creating these montages. And then it becomes reality again by building real structures in public spaces. And maybe a fourth phase is that I photograph these again, and it becomes a fiction, in a sense, a fiction again, like the picture of the column on the staircase. I show it as an autonomous artistic work. So this wave of reality becoming fiction. It becomes reality again, and then becomes fiction again. So this is what's driving me a little bit. Yes, I switch from one to the other.
You switch between idea and gestalt, or body of things.
Execution. I want to see it, because my montages are reflecting my longing to see such structures in real life. They do exist in parts, of course. And they inspire me to make these montages, but as such I don't see them. And they are still plausible. They could be there, but they are not there. They are not science fiction. You can see, of course, if you go to Russia, or you see some glimpses of this really communistic, weird buildings, but yeah, the way I make them, I would love to see them in real, of course. I cannot translate them in the real, so I have to be more abstract. That's why I built these little walls. But in essence, it's the same idea, that I want to translate the things that are going on in a much smaller scale, of course, but that's, yeah.
I don't know if you agree after seeing so much Piranesi in the last 2 days, but some of your works have something very strongly Piranesian. A lot of your the works with the collages on the roofs of, was it Ghent?
No, it was Middelburg. It was a Dutch town. Yes.
Because it
could be Ghent. It could be Ghent. It could be everywhere.
It could be
everywhere.
Just as Piranesi's carceri could have been everywhere, because they were nowhere. They didn't exist as such. And it was actually, your method is not only compressing things. I thought it was like imagining you at an equalizer of reality and driving reality higher and lower in the direction of fiction or not. And that is a way of creating narration or narratives. Upon things. And one problem that one has with theory always is that it is invisible. It's an invisible discipline. But looking at your works, you were talking about the repertoire of the architect by building your shelf, and it was illustrating theory. It was beautiful to realize that theory doesn't have to stay invisible. Yeah. And if we go further on this idea of intention, and that's why I was very happy about the way you closed, Heike. I think monuments have something very decisive in the way they work with intentions and the way they communicate things. And we have been talking a lot about the openness and ambiguity of fragments, but monuments monumental charged objects, which is something different from monuments, they have something very decisive and precise in the way they communicate meaning. And somehow you managed your works, the one you showed at the end, to combine these two attributes: ambiguity on the one hand, in the sense of openness, and on the other hand, this preciseness of the monumental. And I thought it is because you were working with systems of monumental objects, not with monumental objects themselves, systems of voids, and the relation between them, and the way this relation stays dynamic, and also the function of the voids themselves, exclusion, but also allowing an image inside. And yes, I would like you maybe to maybe go further on that, because it was one of the questions that you had from the very beginning with this symposium, the link between the monumental and the fragmental. And I would think maybe it's the link between the system of fragments and the way they relate to each other.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm really a systematic thinker. I actually no, but I think what I do is that I divide things. So I start to, I really, maybe also because of the teaching, I start to think about the single elements. And these elements then are analyzed in different ways, and somehow I try to find the relationships, as I try to show now. The relationships, no matter if they're, for an art historian, have relations, but for me they have a spatial quality which I can find in different contexts, and then I wonder why. And by that, I think I learn, and I by this analysis, I try to figure out what the intention, what the being of this single element is, and then how it is in relation to the whole. But I don't know if this is systematic.
It is in this offer that has been done by fragmentary systems, because we tend to think they are incoherent or in their dynamics open, but they are. It is I think the fragmentary system is characterized mainly by the fact that it's not. It is contingent. One result of it, so for example, the result of your work in the exhibition is one possibility of working inside this, with these elements that you started with. And I think that is actually this contingency of the fragment, choosing one, opening a Möglichkeitsraum, opening a possibility space, space for choice, and then relying on the fact that making a choice doesn't close the system. And this is actually also a way of understanding transition. And you were both actually negotiating on this idea of the transition. You more with the notions. You were speaking about the wall, which is not the boundary, it was the wall, and also understood as a frame a lot in the examples. And in Verena's work, it was transition, a time-based transition between the functions of things, but also transition that takes place because the function, the direct function, is lost. One of your first images was the ruin, and the new function that it became in the spring, as a shelter in the spring morning, Eastern. And to use the metaphor of the garden, where things are growing and transforming in a permanent metamorphosis, was actually the way that you pictured, or you gave a figure to this idea of transformation. And that is actually, again, a system, an open system. What I found especially in your lecture was that you made a lot of points on the art pieces exhibited in the architecture that your practice was transforming, that seemed to be a very concrete dialogue between you were in a dialogue with the collections. You were considering also the works that were important for Konrad Fischer from the beginning to the end while transforming the gallery. Is this part of this process of transformation? We were speaking yesterday a little bit about what is art but not art.
Yeah, it's very complex.
You have to take this.
Yeah, it's a very complex question. Can you hear me? Yeah. Complex question. I said yesterday, I have so much respect for artists. I would never say that our work is an artwork. But on the other hand, of course, we have a strong relationship with approaches that are done by artists. And also I thought today when the white paper was in the space, I thought, I know a lot of artists. I don't know any artist who works like that. I mean, most artists I know work like us, or we work like them, but we are not the artists. So most artists I know, contemporary artists, work with space, work with context. They do artworks that relate to the spaces where they are exhibited. And the idea that the artist is someone who, just one day something comes out of the artist and the white paper is filled, I think it's not the contemporary way to look at art and also how we perceive art. So that's, I think, interesting that maybe our approach to architecture has something to do with the approach of contemporary artists, but it's very different to work as an architect and being commissioned in most cases, or being an artist based on your own. So that's, I think there's a difference that can never be, So this was the first part of the answer. The second, you were mentioning transition. I'm looking at transition. It's not that I've always been thinking this way, but I can see that commissions or architectural works that deal with commissions, with a transition is lying ahead of us. So I'm now looking at the transitions that we have already made and how we have been made and why they were coming to us. And I have been choosing a very small one and a very personal one because I knew Michel Mailleros quite well, so I was involved in the decision for the studio, and that's why I was asked after his death to be involved again in the transition of the studio into an estate, which was a very sensitive and very sensitive moment and also work. And the second one, of course, is interesting because of the way Konrad Fischer and Dorothee Fischer worked with the artists from the beginning. That's why I said most of you might know the story of the gallery. It's a very important gallery and very important also for contemporary artists because the site-specific installations that have been done in this really, really small passage where the gallery was founded. It was not a space, it was an alley. Was very interesting, and we have been working now with the daughter, Berta Fischer, who's also a friend, so it's also a quite personal relationship that led to this project. But we had worked with Vattenfall because we have done a substation, a contemporary substation. So this is why we were linked to Vattenfall, who then offered this for the gallery. Yeah, we were asking them because we knew that they had several buildings that were empty and not used and so on. Yeah, and the artists, I don't know, when I thought about this lecture, I thought that, and also after our talk, I thought that this moment in April 2018 during the gallery weekend when these three artworks were installed and the Lawrence Weiner work is still there, we were a little bit afraid that we were asked, or the gallery would be asked to take it away, but it's still there. even though the facade is listed, which is interesting. So it's preserved, but the artwork is now there, and I think nobody will take it off again. Yeah, and the two others were exhibits that have been taken away, but now there are, of course, exhibitions. So we were not involved in choosing the artworks. It's not my work that I show, it's my observation. Yeah. And I think the whole lecture was done in a way that I wanted to reflect my own observations, partly related to my work, partly related to something else. Yeah.
I think it's quite productive to think about actually the difference between art and architecture in the way it's communicating meaning. And Job made us an offer with the notion of suggestion. And because when you think it's maybe dangerous to leave architecture, get too close to art, it's understandable because the two disciplines communicate differently. Walter Benjamin was using the notion of aleatory. I think he was saying architecture is the object of aleatory perception. Architektur ist Objekt beiläufige Betrachtung. So it happens while passing by, but art we are looking at intentionally and communicating directly. And suggesting something is in between. It's suggesting an idea, but it's not putting it up front, and it is communicating it in a way which stays open, leaves room for the beholder to interpret it in a way or another. And actually the second notion that you used is also one that is based on suggestion, the notion of the figure. Because the figure is something placed between idea and Gestalt. If you have, Erich Auerbach was writing a lot on this notion of the figure, and he was comparing it on the one hand with a rhetorical figure, which is an ornament of the language on the one hand, but is telling something else than the words themselves. And also with phenomenons out of the art history, like the figura serpentinata, which is the description of a sculpture which has a undulating geometry, and this undulation states something else than the bodies in the sculpture. Now to come back to the figure. You started with the particles and the lines, and they stood for the suggestion to something that is not there, a bigger context, and the lines were the suggestion to something that will never be there. So the not yet and the never to realize. Then this is a topos also of the fragmentary, the unfinished, and the ruined, something that was there and it's not there anymore, and something that is planned but not finished. And on the other hand, your objects were, of course, in themselves quite finished. So that the suggestion is not running over the skin of the architecture, but over the way it's being done. I don't know how to make it to a question.
I was waiting for the question.
Yeah. Don't wait anymore.
That's a beautiful summary. I think indeed, I try to make a distinction between two types of suggestiveness, and I think the first one is the particles are more based on the object that want to inscribe themselves into, by referencing into a convention or a tradition, or and I think character is an important element in that, or figure was the word you used, and I think this starts to emerge during the process of the development of the design, where we first start with thinking about what kind of character should be in this place. and that is something that starts to build up a narrative, then that's the only thing we work on, actually. Well, that was easy in this case because there was no program, so we could actually do almost whatever we wanted. The only requirement was that it should be high. And then you start thinking about how to relate to things in the surroundings, very proximate, but also very in the proximity, but also from further away. And then it could be as abstract as a European building tradition, for example, or the way we order our market squares, or things that are part of our collective memory, but also very pragmatic, the usage of materials and patterns of materials that are local. And with this, we build up a character, actually. The other way, the lines is a different category, in which I also had to think a bit about what you did with the rock, Filip, because it's a depiction that you actually, which is flat, and then you place it again in a landscape. This play between flatness and depth is beautiful, I think, and intriguing. Because in this unfinished project that I showed, we also actually use a graphical way of making a relation to something that is actually not there, and also not literally was there, where there's also a joy in the play for a depiction versus depth and space. And then trying to make a relation with other parts in the city. This was a further elaboration on your reading of what I told you. Yeah.
It's fair enough. It wasn't a question, so. Heike, I think maybe we can transfer our panel talk into the wrap-up that we are also planning for closing the thoughts on the three panels. And I would start that with a question in your direction, because we now concluded with this panel that was, in my opinion, very charged atmospherically in the works that have been shown. In different ways, different methods. On the one hand, in this impossibility of the reality that Filip had shown us, the very subtle gestures of transformation and transition with Verena, and these figurative narratives with Job, and then the monumental, going inside and creating another kind of atmosphere. And that is something that is definitely maybe been with us through all the three panels, and very strongly represented also in the exhibition last night, which is also working a lot with the atmosphere, starting from the way you curated it, with the film on the floor that we all avoided to step on. And yes, I would formulate it in a question as such as how much monumentality do we allow for the fragment after reflecting now for 2 days on that?
It's a question of how much. It's much more about why and what for. And for me, a stone can be monumental, or a scenery can be monumental. And it is not, I think it has not only something to do with architecture. But what I believe is that we have sometimes a need to feel the sublime or a certain atmospheric quality, you could maybe say, which gives us the impression that there's something behind. That, you know, there's some other idea behind than only us, probably, whatever it is.
Something bigger.
Yeah, I think it's good that we don't think we are the biggest. And I think the monumental has this possibility, and also it gives us the possibility to build up a hierarchy in space. So I don't think it has to do on something to do with the size. It's something else.
I don't think either. I think monumental has something to do with communicating meaning and with absence, because monuments or monumental charged objects communicate meanings that are for situations or rememberings that are not happening anymore. Some things that are not there are being communicated through the monumental, and it is the same suggestiveness that fragments also have. They communicate something about a context that has been lost or is not reached yet, and they do that through their openness. And if we were to rethink the three panels, and maybe it's also an invitation for everybody in the public and the lecturers from yesterday and today in the morning to participate with last thoughts on our discussion. We started by reflecting on enclosureness, on borders, thresholds, walls, membranes. And this morning we were concentrated on subjectivity, collections, authorship, and now finishing with intention and atmosphere as all attributes of the fragmental. And in a way we are also working fragmentary, because we are defining categories, like reflecting on this notion without, of course, being able to give a closed definition of that. We started also with Jean-Luc Nancy, who said from the very beginning it's impossible to define the fragment, hands off. But still, we gathered a lot of attributes and qualities of the fragmental, and we just named a few, the quality of enclosureness, but also openness, authorship, multi-authorship, multi-layering, stratification, figuration, and now the grotesque, very important, the grotesque. Yes, did we forget something? Are there aspects that maybe in this wrap-up would be important to reflect upon still? Now I made it to a question.
Yeah, very clever. No, I don't think. I hope we remember everything. It was very complex, I think, and I enjoyed it very much. And as Verena said already, and this is maybe from my point of view the final comment for this event, that the intention, I'm questioning myself sometimes why I do this, because it is really a lot of preparation and takes a lot of energy. But I miss sometimes the dialogue among us architects, and probably I'm sometimes also jealous about the stories of the 70s and maybe even 80s, where we have maybe today the impression that they had these kind of discussions together. So this is a try to bring architects together for a certain event, to define a theme, but more important than that, I think, is that maybe each of us can find relations to the work of the others and to learn by that. So this is, I think, for myself, what I hope, what could happen. Yeah.
And it is a very reliable method that you chose to use filters, the filters of these notions, monumental, fragmental, the natural will follow, in order to reflect on built work or on artistic work. It is, of course, the way we navigate intellectually through our work with the help of these notions. They work like transportation, like vehicles, like boats. Yes. Then, and probably it's due also to the late hour and the many lectures that we've heard, I would close by thanking you, Heike, very much for your invitation and for your careful selection. I'm really impressed about the way the lectures worked with each other. I am your guest just as well, and the list of content and of the guests that spoke here these 2 days was your work, and it was very, very sensible put together. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this, and thank you all for discussing with us and working with us on this difficult, fragile notion of the fragment.
Would have not been possible to lead everybody through these 2 days. I would like to thank all architects again who came here, also all our guests for the interest and yeah, for the time to come here. I want to thank again the Villa Massimo and all other supporters of this project. Thanks so much.